I think a lot of people don't realize how essential subs are for movies and potentially music. Some people completely swear off subs like they insulted their mother, and I think it's a combination of purists who feel that they don't need it, which I can totally respect as I am someone who every now and then takes my subs out of the chain during two-channel listening. As well, on the other side, I think it might be people who were left with a bad taste in their mouth, maybe still thinking about the awful sounding car stereos of our youth with the giant overstated subs, or the cringy thought of being stuck at a stoplight next to the car that has its license plate vibrating louder than its music. And I'll be the first to admit it, I started out in car audio when I was a teenager. My subs were loud and obnoxious, but I can happily say those times are behind me. There's a huge variety of subs in the market today, from micro to, well, pretty massive. Today we have the PSA EV1813M, and assembled in the USA, 121 pound, 22 by 20 by 24 sub that is driven with a 1920 watt, 4300 peak ice power amplifier, which falls into the large category, but certainly not huge by today's standards. The EV1813M contains a single 18-inch neodymium subwoofer from B&C in Italy, and it was designed exclusively for PSA. This woofer is based on a dual voice coil motor design with extraordinary motor strength, thermal handling, and sensitivity. I asked Tom, the owner of PSA, what drove him to this somewhat different selection of B&C drivers. It sounded like he was pretty happy with his current drivers, but a rep from B&C actually reached out and asked if they could send over a few subwoofer drivers for them to try out. Tom said he wasn't initially sold on the idea after checking out the published specs and running them through their in-house simulation software. There wasn't much improvement over what they were currently using, and the Italian neodymium driver was significantly more expensive. To cut to the chase, he did end up receiving them in, and after getting the DSP in the ballpark and getting initial measurements, he actually just let them sit. He measured everything that he considered important by most standards, and that was that. After some time, they revisited it, starting with listening sessions, with no expectations based on the measurements that they previously had. Long story short, within a few days, Tom was communicating with Italy about large quantity lead times. So needless to say, they were impressed. What Tom said really caught my attention. He said that this started him on a new and exciting learning adventure, figuring out why something could sound different, but measure essentially the same or very similar. Tom went on to say he wasn't measuring the right thing, or perhaps not accurately understanding the difference between a test tone measurement and the demands of a real source, music or movie, and how that imparts on the subwoofer itself. I think it's really interesting to hear comments like that, and it shows Tom is open to new ideas beyond just matching a woofer to a box, based solely on a calculation. But it should also be said he is far from just subjective. One stipulation for me to even get this sub into review was that I threw it into REW for measurements. I appreciate the combination of subjective thoughts, but grounded in objectivity, as you really need the numbers in some cases to back up claims. And I'll show my room sweeps a little later in the video. Sneak peek, they went really well. If you could, please like and subscribe. I would really appreciate it. I wouldn't bother asking, but it really makes a big difference to my channel. More subscribers and views helps me to get in more fun products like today. Anyways, let's get back to it. Taking a look at the amp, we have the power on and off and standby switch, gain control for setting the output level of the sub, time delay for alignment with your speakers, crossover control 40 to 150 Hz, along with an LFE setting, room size control, which is a less common option, and that's basically a low shelf adjustment, allowing the user to best match room gain to the sub, from what I understand. Then a 12 volt in and out trigger, left and right RCA inputs, XLR inputs, which is a nice addition. These typically start to show up on some of the more premium sub offerings. And finally, the power input. As I mentioned earlier, this is an ICE Power audio technology amp that puts out 1920 watts RMS and 4300 peak. These amps are assembled in Ohio, which is a point of emphasis for Tom. It's very important to Tom and Power Sound Audio to continue to build every one of these products in Ohio. He feels that this is one of the things that sets them apart from their competition at most price points. While the enclosure isn't going to win any beauty contests, it's certainly stout and performs in a manner that leads me to believe it's well designed. This is obviously a ported enclosure, which I typically reserve for home theater, but to be honest, this sub is a little different, and not in the way you might describe your cousin's kid who, I don't know, eats his toe lint. This is different in that I didn't notice that I was listening to a ported sub like I usually do. I feel like there's really something to using a premium pro audio driver like this B&C used here. You do have a limited excursion, but the 18-inch driver certainly makes up for it with its surface area. The quality of bass delivered here is superior to any other sub I reviewed to this point. The combination of their DSP, the amplifier, and this driver provides a superior sounding sub with very articulate and sonically pleasing mid-bass, beyond the obvious deep end slam that this sub produces. I mentioned that I typically reserve ported for home theater, and I generally do, but I could easily blend this into a 2-channel system without really any trade-off. It's tight and accurate, but doesn't put up a billboard stating that I'm a giant sub when I don't want it to. I brought this up to Tom as well. I wanted to know his thoughts on a large ported design like this and how it relates to music. Basically, I wanted to know if he felt as if ported had bridged the gap per se to many who swear by sealed for music-only systems. He said, speaking on their designs only, that a properly ported integrated option can sound every bit as accurate and musical as a sealed counterpart, and went on to say some contributing factors around that would be their amplification combined with their own proprietary DSP hardware and processing, all done in-house, as well as the woofers that I suspect have something to do with this. The ones used here have unusually high motor strength, sensitivity, and thermal handling. Now let's take a look at the measurements and see how this actually performs. I spent some time here talking this one up, so let's take a look at the numbers and see where it lands. I had the sub corner loaded by default as it's generally been the best position in this space with other models. I moved it around to a few other spots, but lucky enough the default worked best. The default was the best here, but honestly this sub was really easy to place. Generally I fight quite a bit with the room, but this was pretty close in all positions. I set the levels to roughly 75 dB on the sub, turned off all my receiver nannies like Odyssey, and off we went with the UMIC 1 mic. First of all, it went deep, and I fully anticipated it too after listening to it for the last month or so. We didn't really have any major fall off till around 12 Hz, and we stayed reasonably flat up to 100 Hz. I figured we were going to end with a pretty strong result here based on this initial measurement. So once I had that all in place, I brought Odyssey back into the picture and measured again. And really it's pretty dang good. This is about as good as you can get with a single sub. Odyssey did end up pulling me down a little bit around 80, but that's not a concern as that's where my crossover comes into play. I could likely play around with the distances a bit to clean that up too. So I could still make some tweaks here and there on this, but this is going to be pretty good for most people. So we've seen the specs and measurements, and that kind of gives you a clear picture of what you get from a larger ported sub like this. Can you get away with a smaller sub? Of course you can. Your room should really play a big part in determining what sub to buy. If your space is large and you're looking for a particular output or tactile feel or sensation, keep in mind it can take a lot of woofer in a large room. A large enclosure paired with a large driver makes everything a sub is trying to accomplish easier. High output is easier to achieve, which in turn lowers distortion on the larger sub, while putting less strain on the driver. Sort of a win-win if you have the space for something like this. It certainly has its advantages, and it's something that surprises a lot of people. You don't have to turn this up very far to reach your desired SPL, and less work, less distortion. We didn't even have to cover room modes to much of an extent today since the measurements were mostly clean. But if you're unaware of these little gremlins, they're basically a collection of frequencies that exist in your room caused by a sound source, like a sub. They can create peaks and dips within your frequency responses, in some cases to extremes. When you have two or more waves meeting in phase with each other, you'll have a peak. And when they're out of phase, that's going to be a null. And this will show up things like boominess in certain areas. That would be a peak, or possibly leave you wondering where your sub even went when you get a cancellation. If your room is a hostile environment for modes, consider adding a second sub. Generally, the reason you see home theater and 2-channel listeners adding a second isn't to get more sound or output. It's just an effective method to smooth out the frequency response. And of course, you'll get a little more overhead as well, which will in turn lower that distortion again. One note, if you check out the website, you'll notice some models end with an M and they're priced a little lower. These are the matte finish cabinets, and they're actually made in China. The non-M models are 100% made and finished in Ohio. The other piece I want to mention is some of the abbreviations on the model names. If you see an EV prefix, the in-room extension is around 14 to 16 Hertz, and the TV will be around 10 to 12. The S simply means sealed. Check out the site. There's actually a large number of models in a variety of sizes. small cubes up to school buses. The products carry a 5-year warranty and can be transferred to third-party buyers if you decide to sell, which is actually really nice for resale value. Tom stated that typically the 2 failures that they see would be something like an amplifier or a driver, and in either case, PowerSound Audio will repair or replace any defective part with a new or renewed part during the warranty period. If the product under warranty has been discontinued or cannot be repaired, PowerSound Audio will replace the original product with a product of equal or greater value, either new or renewed. I don't have much else to say here. The sub met and exceeded basically all my expectations. Its home theater performance was top notch, and it even integrated really cleanly with music. I have no problems recommending this for the buyer in this market. When you price it out and go spec for spec to the competition, it's up there with the best in this category. If you could, please like and subscribe so we can grow this channel together, get in more gear for review, and all the things like that. I'd really appreciate it. Take care, everyone, and I'll talk to you later. Bye.